Good evening. I'm Ken Lesbader, one of the co-founders of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, and we're really pleased to be partnering with the Shayne Watson and Marcia Gallo, and I want to thank Amanda Davis, our project manager, for coordinating this event. We have a record number of signups. Over 350 people signed up for this Zoom event. We are doing this presentation in present mode on Zoom, which is not a webinar. So in the spirit of community, especially in these dark days, feel free to show your face if you're so inclined or comfortable. But it's always nice to see people who are in the audience, and feel free to put your questions in the chats.
Yes, and also if you'd like, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always fun to see the reach that these programs have since we've pivoted to Zoom 5 years ago from the pandemic. The one upshot was that we were able to offer these programs to a wider array of people beyond the New York City area.
We've got the Wisconsin LGBTQ History Project. That's great.
Oh,
Unfortunately,
fun.
Jay Shockley, who's one of our co-directors, co-founders, he went to the University of Wisconsin and would love to
Yeah,
have
Madison, yeah.
to know someone is here from Madison. I just want to shout out, because I see her on my screen, Deborah Dell, who's on our advisory committee, but also one of the co-founders of the Lesbian History Archive,
Yes.
Her Story Archive. And I just want to thank her for her work and the legacy that she's given us and the resource she's given us.
Absolutely. Hey, Deb.
Oh, this is great. Oklahoma City, Asheville, North Carolina.
North Adams, yay.
North Adams.
Northampton.
Japan. Wow. Very impressive. We had someone from Switzerland ask if this would be recorded because it would be in the middle of the night for her. So that was great. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. As Ken mentioned earlier, this is a record turnout for us, record signups, and we're really thrilled to be able to share this program with you in honor of Women's History Month, and also in honor of the 70th anniversary of the founding of the Daughters of Bilitis in 1955. And this photo here is in the collection of the GLBT Historical Society, the Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon papers, and we'll be hearing much more of Martin and Lyon tonight. This program tonight is hosted by the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. I'm the project manager of that initiative, and I just wanted to share a few slides of who we are before we get started with tonight's program. The NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, we're historic preservationists, and what we do is we map LGBTQ historic sites throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City. Our earliest site dates to the 17th century, and we have almost 500 sites on the website, and still doing research and writing and adding more. And as you can see, we have these different pins connected to different kinds of historic places that we map to give you a sense of the kinds of places that we're researching. And you can also filter the map. So for tonight's program, if you wanted to, there's a box, lesbian, activism, bars, 1960s, you can sort the pins that way, or use our search tool for something specific, like if you're searching for Barbara Giddings, for example. And we also, for all the sites that we have, we have created a number of curated themes, or these thematic collections of historic sites. And tonight I pulled some for Women's History Month and for this program specifically that might interest you. 1970s lesbian activism and community, a whole range of those following Stonewall, lesbian progressive reformers looking at the 19th century and early 20th century, and also, of course, transgender history, communities of color, activism before Stonewall, and all sorts of different topics that you can dive into. And also, this program is being recorded and will be added to our YouTube channel. And I just wanted to share some of our past programs that we've done connected to lesbian history in New York City. Tonight, we won't be focusing too much on the bar scene, but we do have one Cheers Queers, the past and future of NYC's lesbian bars, with one of our former graduate interns, Gwendolyn Stiegel. And we have a 3-part series down below here, including a whole host of sites connected to lesbian history. So we hope you'll take the time to check those out if any of these are of interest to you. And our project, beyond our website and the other work that we do, we give walking tours in Greenwich Village around Stonewall National Monument, and also annual cemetery tours in Greenwood in Brooklyn, and also Woodlawn in the Bronx. We're holding both of those again this June, and the walking tours also happen in June as part of a fundraiser for our project. And so now I want to introduce our 2 guest speakers for tonight's program. Marcia Gallo is the author of 2 award-winning books, Different Daughters, A History of the Daughters of Bilitis and the Rise of the Lesbian Rights Movement, and her second book, No One Helped, Kitty Genevieve's New York City and the Myth of Urban Apathy, which we were just talking about would be a great future program. She has researched and written about mid to late 20th century feminist history, focusing on the ways in which women of color, working and poor women, and sexually nonconforming women organize for civil and human rights. Having retired from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas as professor emerita in 2020, Marcia continues to teach, lecture, and write about race, gender, and sexuality, as well as public history and oral history. And Shayne Watson is a San Francisco Bay Area-based historian, historic preservation planner, and founder of Watson Heritage Consulting. A nationally recognized advocate for LGBTQ heritage, she is co-author of 2 award-winning works, Citywide Historic Context Statement for LGBTQ History in San Francisco, and also the San Francisco chapter of the National Park Service's LGBTQ America, a theme study of LGBTQ history, which unfortunately has been taken down from the National Park Service site, but has been uploaded by our colleagues at outhistory.org on their website. Shayne is a longtime volunteer for San Francisco's GLBT Historical Society and serves on the advisory board for the Castro LGBTQ Cultural District. In 2020, Shayne founded Friends of Lion Martin House to spearhead efforts to landmark and revitalize the home of trailblazing lesbian activists Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin. And so now Marcia will open with an overall history of the Daughters of Bilitis, and then Shayne will share a selection of DOB sites in San Francisco, and then I'll follow and do the same for New York City. And then there will be time for Q&A at the end, so we encourage you to please share questions and comments in the chat that we'll get to at the end of the program.
Should I just jump in?
Yes, go for it.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon/evening. It's really overwhelming to have so many people from all over the country and the world here with us tonight. Thank you. I also want to give a big thanks to Amanda, to Shayne, to Christiana, Ken, and the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project for the invitation to be here with you tonight. Slide, please. It's my pleasure, actually, and my honor to discuss the significance of the Daughters of Bilitis, or DOB, the first national organization of lesbians in the United States. It's an inspiring story of a small group of lesbians who helped change the world. Slide. Slide, please. Thanks. From the time I first met Del and Phyllis when I was an organizer with the ACLU in San Francisco in the mid-1980s, my interest in them and the organization they and many others created has been to understand it, to lift it up, and to celebrate their consistent efforts. I think it's especially amazing that they accomplished so much during a stifling and chilling era that is eerily similar to the one we are living through today. Slide. DOB was conceived and created when the national and international news was dominated by corrupt and cruel men, such as Joseph McCarthy, on the right here, and his henchman, Roy Cohn. Together, they seized the reins of power in the US Senate and condemned all those who were associated with or advocated for liberal or progressive ideas. These men deemed their enemies subversive. The damage they inflicted, most notably captured in Lillian Hellman's amazing account named Scoundrel Time, among many other first-person remembrances, still linger today. And of course, we can blame Roy Cohn for our current horrors. After his reign of terror with McCarthy, he went on to mentor a young, greedy New York real estate developer who yearned to be rich, famous, and powerful, no matter the cost. There is a direct link between Cohn and Donald Trump. From the early 1970s, when the US government sued Trump and his father for discriminating against Black renters in the apartments they managed. A Washington Post article about Cohn's influence, which was published during the 2016 presidential campaign, had the headline, quote, "The man who showed Donald Trump how to exploit power and instill fear." And it summed up his lesson as, quote, "a simple formula: attack, counterattack, and never apologize." Cohn was also expert at media manipulation. Slide. Cohn, McCarthy, and others like them poisoned the cultural, legal, and medical landscapes in the 1950s. An example for us, then I'm sure we're familiar with them, are the popular paperback novels of the era, including those written by women who promoted love between women and who were lesbians themselves, such as Anne Bannon, slide, and Valerie Taylor. Their books could only be published at this time if they did not directly challenge the norms that punished women for same-sex love. Slide. And all of the major media also promoted psychiatric experts who defined lesbianism as a sickness and questioned whether homosexuality could be cured. Many people, including those who would become leaders in the LGBTQ+ movements, such as Barbara Giddings and Kayla Husin, had unsuccessfully sought solutions for their lesbianism from psychiatry or psychology. Slide. And despite the availability of bars or restaurants where women gathered together, no one was safe. Raids and arrests were routine. In fact, it was in large part due to the bar raids in San Francisco in 1954, just before Phyllis Lyon's 30th birthday, that motivated 4 lesbian couples, including Phyllis and her partner Del Martin, to create an alternative. DOB began when they met in September 1955 to plan a small, secret club for women in the San Francisco Bay Area. Slide. Over the next 15 years, their secret club, with the exceedingly odd name Daughters of Bilitis, grew into a national and international network and helped create lesbian and feminist visibility and activism in the second half of the 20th century. Next. From social gatherings in members' homes to picnics in local parks, they even organized trips to petting zoos. This is a photo that Kay took of Barbara petting a lamb somewhere in New York. They created activities that brought women together safely. Next slide. By the early to mid-1960s, there were hundreds of members and supporters in local chapters in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and others. They in turn inspired other women around the world for the next 25 years, from London, UK to Melbourne, Australia. One of the US chapters in Boston maintained its meeting space into the 2000s. Next. Perhaps most importantly, however, despite the intense racial segregation of the era, DOB's founders included 2 women of color, a Filipina and a Chicana. Another early member, shown here in a rare photo, was Pat W. Walker, a small business owner in Berkeley, who joined in 1958 and led the San Francisco chapter in 1960. That meant hosting member gatherings at her home, as well as organizing public meetings with friendly lawyers and mental health professionals. And Pat did this despite her inability to see. She was blind. DOB also was the first national LGBTQ organization to be led by a Black lesbian, Cleo Glenn Bonner, from 1963 to 1966. In addition to her leadership in San Francisco, Bonner traveled to New York to preside over DOB's first conference outside the Bay Area in 1963. Next. All of this activity, however, could only be documented and promoted by another of their most significant achievements. Starting in 1956, DOB published a monthly magazine, The Ladder, written, printed, assembled, and mailed by the volunteer labor of DOB members and supporters. It was essential to their success as organizers. The Ladder, which was published until 1972, provided a means of communication, debate, political development for women in the US and around the world. It promoted lesbian writers, artists, and activists, and inspired the development of similar magazines in the 1960s and beyond. Next. And one of the first letters they received, surprisingly, was from playwright Lorraine Hansberry, soon to be celebrated for her groundbreaking play, A Raisin in the Sun, on Broadway. As Hansberry wrote from New York months after she received her first issue, "I'm glad as heck that you exist. Women, like other oppressed groups of one kind or another, have particularly had to pay a price for the intellectual impoverishment that the second-class status imposed on us for centuries created and sustained. Thus, I feel that the Ladder is a fine elementary step in a rewarding direction." Hansberry continued her involvement with the magazine for the next couple of years, sending in commentary and short stories under a pseudonym. Next. The Ladder always was a labor of love, as I mentioned earlier, and it relied on volunteer labor for its substance and for its assembly, printing, and mailing. Activists such as Barbara Giddings and her partner Kay Tobin Lahusen were instrumental in advancing the Ladder's look and its substance. The photo that you're looking at on the left is a group of neighbors that they somehow convinced to help them put pages together in their apartment. And on the right is Barbara posing next to the mimeograph machine taken by Kay. Next. And I think it's significant to note that under Barbara Giddings' editorship, the Ladder's cover illustrations became bolder, much more expressive. She sought out artists from within the membership and beyond it. Next. They also began, and this was revolutionary, to include photographs of DOB members and Ladder subscribers. You see here Jervan Brahm, who wrote in from Indonesia, and Ernestine Eckstein on the right, a young and energetic member of the New York DOB chapter who would help lead the organization into more visible activism. Next. Ernestine Eckstein was a singular member of the DOB. Her real name was Ernestine Eppinger, and she was among many DOB members who would use a pseudonym in their work. After completing college at Indiana University in Bloomington, Ernestine moved to New York in 1964 and quickly became one of the most important leaders of the DOB in the mid-1960s. She served as vice president of the DOB New York chapter. In addition to agreeing to be featured on the Ladder's cover, she also actively encouraged the organization to engage in public demonstrations. And you can see her here in the photo on the left, picketing for LGBTQ rights in '66. She wanted also that the LGBT movement should adapt some of the lessons of the Black civil rights movement, with which she also was involved. I highly recommend accessing the wonderful and long, it's about 5 hours, tape-recorded interview with Ernestine, conducted by Barbara and Kay. It's available at the William Way LGBT Community Center in Philadelphia, and I'll be happy to provide the link in the chat. Next. So the impetus for increased public activism is also happening in San Francisco. Phyllis Lyon had gone to work for the Glide Memorial Church, a center for anti-racist and progressive political activism in the city. She said she staffed the gay desk at the church, and here she's shown on the left, joining a picket calling attention to anti-gay discrimination in the US Armed Forces. On the right, she and Del Martin and an unknown woman are shown with the Reverend Cecil Williams, who was Glide's extraordinary pastor and political leader and a force to be reckoned with in San Francisco. Next. Activism and lesbian visibility also increased in the early years of the next decade, when Los Angeles Daughters of Bilitis member and former nun, Jean Cordova, she's in the middle photo, took over the LA chapter's newsletter, reinvented it, and made it into an important feminist lesbian publication known as the Lesbian Tide. Lesbian Tide, published from 1971 to 1982, helped bridge the two movements, lesbianism and feminism, and was vitally important to promoting feminists of color. Next. Cordova also came to the defense of one of the first trans women who was a DOB activist. Her name is Beth Elliott. She's shown here with the "Revolution, It's Just a Kiss Away" sign. And in the early 1970s, Beth joined the San Francisco chapter of DOB and was open and honest about her transition from male to female. She said she always felt herself to be a woman, had taken the hormones and had surgery to become a woman, and was emotionally and erotically attracted to other women. Therefore, she was a lesbian. Enough people in the chapter supported her to elect her vice president, but she was outed publicly about a year later by a former friend who had turned against her, and she resigned from DOB in 1974. It caused a huge split in the organization, and I think it was a precursor of the struggles among lesbians over trans inclusion that we know has continued for decades. I have to note here that Beth was one of the very first people to respond to my request for an interview when I began working on my book. I had been given pages and pages of phone numbers and addresses by Phyllis Lyon when I asked her to help me with my research. She opened her infamous Rolodex, which was chock full of addresses and phone numbers, and she generously shared them with me. She and Del also co-wrote and signed a letter of introduction for me, and I am forever grateful for their trust and their assistance. Next. As the years went on, in addition to their continuing involvement in the LGBTQ+ activist movement, all four of DOB's founding mothers, Lyon, Martin, Giddings, and Lahusen, three of them writers, one a photojournalist, also documented and published their experiences as activists. In the early 1970s, Giddings in particular helped to create visibility in established professional organizations, such as the American Library Association. Here she and Kay, along with Del and Phyllis and other lesbian, gay, queer writers, are shown at the ALA's annual convention in 1973 with their prize-winning books. Next. And despite living on opposite coasts, all four remained friends and allies. Here they are celebrating the opening of San Francisco Library's James Hormel Center in 1991. And I had the great good fortune of bringing them all together in New York in 1987 when Phil and Del came to the city to give a talk, and they gave a talk at the Lesbian History Archives. I also had them come to a joyous dinner in Wilmington, Delaware, at Barbara and Kay's home there. Barbara and I shared a hometown of Wilmington. Del and Phyllis never forgot their opportunity to not only come east and to visit the archives, but to also spend time with their friends. Next. And for me, the decades of friendship, camaraderie, personal and professional assistance, and love that both my partner Anne, shown here with Del, myself, and Phyllis, has been a great gift. And we're sitting here in this photo at their favorite restaurant on San Francisco's waterfront, the Delancey Street restaurant. As you know, Del passed away in 2008, Phyllis in 2020. Next. And despite her debilitating health challenges toward the end of her life, Barbara Giddings helped my family and I celebrate the publication of my book on DOB in our shared hometown of Wilmington. This was shortly before she died, right after the book was published. Next, please. I also had the opportunity to enjoy many, many visits with Kay Tobin Lahusen during her final years. She lived in nearby Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, and was surrounded by photographs, books, the memorabilia of all kinds. And she loved seeing her many friends until her death in 2021. I love this about Kay, an activist to the end. She even established a gay table in the dining room at the extended care facility that she lived in, the Kendall at Longwood. And as she always reminded us, when facing social and political challenges, don't let them get you down. Do something about it. Today, as always, I think her words ring true. Thank you.
Okay, great. And now up for Shayne and focusing on sites in San Francisco.
Thanks, Amanda. Good evening, everyone. My name is Shayne Watson, and I'm very honored to be here with Marcia and Amanda to discuss the history of the Daughters of Bilitis through 7 key sites in the San Francisco Bay Area. The first site, which you can see here, is the home of Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon. This modest 700 square foot cottage is perhaps the most famous DOB site, as it was where co-founders Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon lived for over 5 decades, starting in 1955. Their home quickly became a center for activism, where they organized and wrote the first issues of the latter and built a national movement at a time when lesbian existence was largely hidden. It was also a vital social space, hosting DOB gatherings such as their famous Halloween and New Year's Eve parties through the mid-1960s at least. Beyond DOB, Martin and Lyon's activism shaped broader LGBTQ rights movements. Their work led to the declassification of homosexuality as a mental disorder in 1973, and Del Martin's groundbreaking book, Battered Wives, published in 1976, helped to launch the modern fight against domestic violence. Their activism culminated in their 2008 marriage, the first same-sex wedding officiated in California after the state's Supreme Court overturned the ban. In 2021, the Friends of Lyon Martin House successfully fought for the site's designation as a San Francisco landmark. However, the house now faces a new threat, not from redevelopment, but from demolition by neglect. Next slide. This is an image of Del on the left and Phyllis on the right, 2 historic images superimposed on a current image of the living room, which is vacant. And I just want to note that this entire property was documented by SciArc, and there's a really lovely 3D tour you can take, hosted at different spots by different historians, including Marcia Gallo and Susan Stryker. Maybe someone can put that in the chat. Next slide, please. Rose Bamberger, who is on the right in the lower left photo, a Filipino-American lesbian, originally proposed the idea of forming a private social group for lesbians, leading the creation of the Daughters of Bilitis. She was born and raised in the Philippines to a Spanish-American war veteran. In 1948, Rose moved to San Francisco, where she worked as a brush maker at the Mork division of the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company. It was likely there that she met Rosemary Slipen, seen here on the left and the lower right, a fellow factory worker and her future life partner. By 1953, Rose and Rosemary were living together, first at 1201 Sanchez Street, the house on the left, in Noe Valley, and later at 53 Venus Street, where they hosted the first formal meeting of the DOB at their home in October 1955. And it was at this meeting where the group adopted a motto, the bylaws, and elected officers, with Rosemary serving as the first treasurer. Although Rose and Rosemary left DOB in early 1956 due to philosophical differences in how the group was structured, they stayed very active in lesbian social groups and continued living together for decades until Rose's death in 1990. Next slide, please. And this is just a couple cute advertisements from the factory where Rose and Rosemary both worked in the 1950s. They were blue-collar workers making paintbrushes, which was very different from Del and Phyllis, for example, who worked as clerks and writers and bookkeepers and such. Next slide, please. The women of DOB understood the importance of both political activism and community building. Their early social gatherings played a crucial role in strengthening the lesbian community, providing both joy and solidarity. The first of these picnics took place at Samuel P. Taylor Park in Marin County on September 30th, 1956, but it was a one-time event, and I'm not sure why they didn't go back. As Marcia mentioned, in the following years, they moved to Tilden Park in Berkeley. And beginning in around 1960, Alum Rock Park in San Jose, about an hour south of San Francisco, became the site of their annual picnic gatherings. These picnics offered a rare and safe outdoor space away from police harassment and societal scrutiny. The location near the swimming pool west of the log cabin became a regular spot where attendees were encouraged to bring swimsuits and enjoy a relaxed, supportive setting free from discrimination. And that map you can see on the right was included in one of the early DOB newsletters. Next slide, please. First office of the Daughters of Bilitis, and this was in San Francisco. By early 1957, the Daughters of Bilitis had outgrown members' homes and secured a small shared space in an old office building in San Francisco's South of Market neighborhood. They shared the office with the Mattachine Society, the organization founded for gay men a few years before DOB. An early mention in the latter joked, quote, "For the present, you can reach us via the phone number of the Mattachine Society, who has offices next door and across the hall. Our own private phone is still a future project. Phones cost money, you know," end quote. From their first headquarters at the Williams Building, DOB expanded their reach, corresponding with lesbians nationwide and publishing the latter. Having an official office was a bold step, signaling their increasing visibility and determination despite the risks of exposure. Next slide, please. Beginning in 1956, the DOB hosted monthly public discussion panels on the 5th floor of this 1922 office building in San Francisco's Theater District. These groundbreaking forums addressed topics such as legal rights, employment discrimination, self-acceptance, and the broader challenges faced by lesbians in the homophile community. The meetings, attended by both men and women, men from the Mattachine Society usually, ranged from small gatherings to audiences of over 50 people. The first panel, which was held on October 23rd, 1956, was originally intended to address lesbian fears in general, but shifted focus to legal rights after a police raid at a local bar, which resulted in the arrest of 36 lesbians. Attorney Benjamin Davis led the discussion titled "What to Do in Case of Arrest, the Lesbian and the Law," and subsequent panels covered topics such as fear and human emotions and the possibility of same-sex marriage. They hosted 15 panels in this space on the top floor from 1956 to 1958. Next slide, please. As Marcia mentioned, Glide Memorial Church was a pivotal ally for the Daughters of Bilitis. Glide is located in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco, offering critical support during a time when few institutions were willing to engage with LGBTQ issues. The church became a hub for DOB events, including talks on homosexuality and civil rights. Under the leadership of Cecil Williams, Glide Memorial was not only a church, but a driving force in the modern LGBTQ rights movements, both locally and nationally. The church's early efforts to address the social costs of anti-gay and anti-transgender discrimination helped gain mainstream attention to these issues. A key part of Glide's legacy was the Council on Religion and Homosexual, founded in 1964. The CRH played a groundbreaking role in advocating for LGBTQ rights within religious communities. One of its most significant events and one of San Francisco's earliest significant LGBTQ events was the CRH's Mardi Gras ball on New Year's Day, January 1965, when police raided and arrested several of the ministers who showed up in support, as well as the Daughters of Bilitis, the Mattachine Society, the Tavern Guild, and several other local homophile groups were there to support. And the church was home to the first organization in addition, the church, Glide was the first organization in the country to support dispossessed queer youth and sex workers in the Tenderloin and hosted the first support groups for transgender individuals. Glide Memorial Church remains a vital center for advocating equality, dignity, and access to resources for marginalized communities. Glide was listed in the National Register of Historic Places for its role in LGBTQ history a few years ago. And then last slide. It was a Methodist church, by the way. The DOB Union Hall at 3470 Mission Street. As the DOB grew, they needed a larger space. In December 1964, they posted a call in the ladder for a new location, ideally over a store, which would have been closed at night and it was easily accessible for women living all across the city. Later that year, they secured this large venue at 3470 Mission Street, which they nicknamed DOB Union Hall. It served as their true first headquarters for meetings, social events, and organizing. The new hall immediately transformed DOB's ability to bring the community together and quickly became a lively social space and key part of the organization's growth. And that's my final slide.
Thank you, Shayne.
Thanks. On to you, Amanda.
Thank you. Passing the baton. All right, gonna get my back up and running here. Okay, so I'm gonna end this portion of the program by looking at a few sites in New York City that connect to DOB's legacy. DOB's story in New York pretty much begins in 1958 here at the Barbizon Plaza Hotel on Central Park South, which turned out to be a popular place for early lesbian and gay-themed conferences. And the group that met here most often was the Mattachine Society. And as Shayne mentioned, Mattachine was founded a bit earlier than DOB in Los Angeles in 1951, before expanding nationally, including a New York chapter in 1955. And it primarily served gay men, but lesbians were also members. And there was a lot of collaboration between DOB and Mattachine in these pre-Stonewall years. And on Labor Day weekend, 1958, DOB members attended Mattachine's 5th annual convention at the Barbizon Plaza, and you see that in this ad placed in the Mattachine Review. And by the way, also later this year, we're planning a program on Mattachine, so stay tuned for that. This December 1957 issue of The Ladder spells out DOB's goal for that 1958 convention, which was to expand beyond San Francisco and establish a presence in the Northeast. It says here that some of the daughters, quote, will spend their 2-week vacations in the area and should have ample time between sightseeing excursions, important, to discuss possibilities for a chapter or chapters in the area. And so out of this came the New York chapter, which held its formative meeting a week later in September of 1958, and about 9 women attended. The New York chapter of DOB had its first long-term office in a space that they shared with Mattachine, and this was at 1133 Broadway near Madison Square Park. DOB was here from 1958 to 1961. Mattachine was there through 68. And on the right is the New York chapter's DOB very first newsletter, a 1959 issue. It shows that there were 10 active members, 6 associate members, and a mailing list of over 35, and that the group had office hours on Thursday nights and a lending library of about 50 lesbian-themed fiction and nonfiction books. Social events included a spring fling party for members and their guests, and a joint picnic with Mattachine on Fire Island. Unfortunately, we don't have any photos of the DOB space at 1133 Broadway, none that we know of anyway. But here are the 2 New York chapter co-founders, as we've already heard, Barbara Giddings, who was the one to start up the New York newsletter and was DOB New York's first president for the first 3 years. And then Marion Glass, who also went by the pseudonym Meredith Gray. Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin had personally asked Barbara to start the first East Coast group. Barbara lived in Philadelphia, but traveled to New York a lot, and Marion lived in Woodside, Queens in New York City. And Shayne sent me this wallet bag that she found in the DOB San Francisco chapter newsletter from 1960. So let us know in the chat if you were around in 1960, if you would have ordered this wallet bag that the New York chapter was offering. So you have 4 colors to choose from. Jet black is contingent on demand. You would have sent your check or money order of $1.50 postpaid anywhere to the 1133 Broadway office, room 304, and addressed it to Meredith Gray, the pseudonym of Marion Glass. The Barbizon Plaza, coming back to this site, also hosted the DOB National Organization for its third biennial convention, Threshold of the Future, in June of 1964. And by this point, DOB New York had its offices on West 28th Street in Chelsea, in a building, and actually a block that has been demolished. So unfortunately, we don't have that site to share. The convention was supposed to take place at the Hotel New Yorker, but DOB was uninvited by the hotel, and they didn't know why until years later when they looked through their FBI files and read that a woman had complained to the hotel manager that quote unquote degenerates would be meeting there. This is a story that Marcia shared with me. And the convention at the Barbizon Plaza was covered in the New York Times, and the article notes that about 100 people, including psychologists and gay men, attended the first day, with the second day only open to DOB members. And one of the topics was challenging the long-held medical opinion that homosexuality was a disease. And this was a cause that LGBTQ activists really took on over the course of the next decade. Kay Lahusen, as we've already heard, was the life partner of Barbara Giddings and sometimes went by her pseudonym Kay Tobin. And we got to meet her before she died, and that's a few of us from the project, including our colleague Gail Harris, visiting her at the assisted living facility where she lived and held that gay roundtable that Marcia mentioned earlier. And the dress I'm wearing is also behind me. If you know the historic link to that, mention it in the chat. You'll see it pop up in a few slides if you don't. So Kay told me that she really wanted to live in New York in the 60s because that's where the action was, she said. But Barbara preferred Philadelphia. So from 1967 to 1973, Kay rented a ground floor apartment on 13th Street in the East Village, and Barbara stayed here with her when she was in the city. Kay's path as an activist began in Boston around 1960, when a recently published book about lesbians led her to track down its author, a psychiatrist in New York City. The book did not offer a positive portrayal, but she booked an appointment with this psychiatrist anyway, simply to ask him where she could meet other lesbians. And he told her, the Daughters of Bilitis, and they had a New York office, and there she went. And there were only a handful of lesbians at the first meeting she attended, and she said only about 200 people in the LGBTQ rights movement nationwide at that time. And from here, Kay would go on to meet Barbara in 1961 at a DOB picnic in Rhode Island. And when Barbara took over as editor of the latter from 1963 to 1966, as Marcia mentioned earlier, Kay took photos of lesbians for the cover, replacing the line drawings of the earlier issues. And Kay's role as a really important photojournalist of this pre- and post-Stonewall era of the community of the LGBTQ rights movement now form part of a collection that she and Barbara donated to the New York Public Library. And a lot of those photos are available digitally through nypl.org. And Kay and Barbara took part in the annual Reminder Day demonstrations in the mid to late 1960s in Philadelphia. And these were held yearly on July 4th in front of Independence Hall to protest the homosexual community's lack of basic civil rights. These were replaced after the 1969 Stonewall uprising by what we would today call pride marches held in June around the country. And the dress behind me is a replica, if you already guessed it, of the one that Barbara is wearing on the right at the 1966 annual Reminder Day. I sew as a hobby, so that was my attempt at a replica. That made it all the way to Kay knowing about it, which was a pretty fun ride. So Kay and Barbara by that time had already left DOB for other activist causes. Kay, for example, became the only lesbian founder of the Gay Activists Alliance, which formed soon after Stonewall in New York. And it was a group that included the LGBTQ community in general, but she was the only lesbian founder. And Barbara worked alongside fellow gay rights leader Frank Kameny. They really worked hand in hand beginning in the mid-1960s on a number of important issues. In this one, they worked to push the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its list of mental disorders, which finally happened in 73 and 74. And Barbara, as Marcia mentioned earlier, was also really passionate about making sure LGBTQ youth had access to positive books about themselves, ones she wished she had had when she was young. And Barbara and Kay are pictured here on the left in 1994 at the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. And a few years ago, two of us from the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project visited their memorial bench at Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C., and planted this progress flag in their memory. And the bench reads, "Gay pioneers who spoke truth to power. Gay is good." And it also reads, "Partners in life, married in our hearts." And the term "gay is good" was coined by their good friend, Frank Kameny, who is buried nearby, along with a number of other LGBTQ veterans, including Leonard Matlovich. Lorraine Hansberry, as Marcia mentioned, was an early contributor to the latter, and this is where she lived when that happened, the top floor of 337 Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village, just north of Christopher Street, not too far from Stonewall if you're in the area and visiting. She lived here from 1953 to 1960, so it is also where she wrote A Raisin in the Sun. She's seen here in her apartment, behind her trusty typewriter for a photo shoot for Vogue magazine, soon after Raisin became a huge hit on Broadway, making her the first Black woman to have a play staged on Broadway for an extended run. And a few years ago, we were able to list this site on the National Register of Historic Places, one of a dozen listings we've worked on in New York City to recognize LGBTQ contributions to American history. And if you've been following the chaotic news on this one, chaotic news in general, but in the history field, LGBTQ history is actively being erased from the National Park Service's website. But our project and groups like outhistory.org have been uploading this information onto our websites so that this important work isn't lost for future generations. Hansberry invited Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin to her apartment in 1958, and there she told them that she couldn't get more involved in DOB beyond contributing to the latter, but that was a really important contribution. And we have here, Marcia mentioned this earlier, but the line that inspired tonight's event title comes from this letter that Hansberry wrote to the latter in 1957. "I'm glad as heck that you exist." And she wrote this under the initials LHN to protect her identity, and was Nemiroff, her married name. And she also writes at the top, I love this, that she sent $2 so she could get as many back issues of the latter as that amount would cover. And if she sent more money than was needed, well, fine, she says, let that go toward a donation. So she was very eager to continue reading the latter, and a really important lifeline for so many in this period. Hansberry also submitted short stories to the latter, including this 10-page one under the pen name of Emily Jones in September of 1958. And the full short story is available on archive.org. A number of issues of the latter are available there digitally. And Marcia mentioned Ernestine Eckstein. When she became vice president of DOB New York in the mid-1960s, she lived in an apartment here on 12th Street in the East Village. And on the right is a contact sheet, or a portion of it, of photos that Kayla Husen took of Ernestine in and near Washington Square Park, with one of them ending up as a cover for the latter in 1966, which we've seen a couple of times already. And in that issue, Ernestine told Barbara and Kay, "I'd never known anyone who was homosexual, never heard that word mentioned. This was a kind of blank that had never been filled in by anything, reading, experience, anything, until after I came to New York." So really showing the power of place that was so common in this period and after and before. And she actually first got involved with the movement after seeing an ad for the Mattachine Society in the Village Voice, which was a Greenwich Village-based paper. This is not the ad she would have seen. This was posted a few months before she arrived in New York, but it gives you an idea of the kind of ad that she might have seen. She joined Mattachine and through that learned about DOB. And the Daughters of Bilitis also had social gatherings in the Rockaways at Reese Park Beach in Queens. The northern isolated section of the beach was affectionately known as Gay Beach or Screech Beach and drew LGBTQ people, including people of color, since at least the 1940s. And this is an aerial pointing to where this section of the beach is. It's still popular today. This photo in the collection of the Lesbian Her Story archives shows a group of women at the beach in the 1960s. And here again is Ernestine with Emma Van Cott in that same section of the beach in 1965. That building in the back is in both photos, so it's really helpful to locate where they are. And on the right is a 1968 flyer for a DOB beach party that appeared in the New York chapter's newsletter. Women could take the subway, it says, to Flatbush Avenue, which is also the Brooklyn College stop, and a bus marked Reese Park would be waiting to take them to the beach. And it's a little hard to read, but the small text says, "La Femmes and others are to bring boxed lunches with sandwiches and all sorts of goodies. Jen will auction them off at noon. The highest bidder gets to share the lunch with the femme who brought it." And finally, the Daughters of Bilitis Center, or as some called it, the Lesbian Center in Soho, was the first exclusively lesbian center in New York City, and one of the first two in the country, the other being in Los Angeles. It was located in a second floor, 4,000 square foot loft here on Prince Street from January to September 1971, so after Stonewall, before it moved to another location because of conflicts with the landlord. Ruth Simpson at center was then president of DOB New York. Ellen Pavel at left was vice president, and on the right is her partner, Eileen Webb. And here is Ruth in what is likely the Soho location of the DOB Center, along with the 1971 cover page of the Lesbian newsletter published by DOB New York with the Prince Street address up top. And we have all these images and more information on our website if you're interested in looking at them a little longer. The opening of the DOB Center was covered in the New York Times in a piece called "The Disciple of Sappho Updated." By this point, DOB was considered conservative in comparison to newly formed groups of the post-Stonewall era, but the New York chapter had about 400 members, including about 60 Black women, and the space was also used for dances, and it was equipped with a jukebox named Aphrodite. Lesbians from post-Stonewall groups like the Gay Liberation Front, Gay Activists Alliance, and Radical Lesbians also attended these dances. And the DOB Center eventually closed soon after, with the Women's Liberation Center in Chelsea being the place where newer and more radical groups of the lesbian liberation movement met in the 1970s. And this was another site we got listed on the National Register, and one that we've mapped on our website, in addition to many other sites connected to 1970s lesbian activism and community. So thank you for that. Thank you for listening to this portion of the program, and we're going to move to Q&A. Sorry, that was not a very graceful transition, but actually before that, we did put together some further resources for you, including the SciArc digital mapping of the Lion Martin House, which someone may have already shared in the chat, and a number of other, including the Making Gay History podcast has a number of audio interviews with Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon and Barbara Giddings, Kayla Husen, and others. So it's a really great podcast to check out. So now I think we're going to move to Q&A, and we're going to check to see. I guess I can stop sharing here. So someone asks here if one of us could talk more about the international connections of the DOB. And Marcia, I wonder if you could speak to that. Yeah.
Yeah, both in the UK and in Australia. There were connections and inspiration, actually, from DOB to organizers in both of those places. In London, Barbara and Kay were very much in communication on a regular basis with the founder of what was called the Minorities Research Group, which was the fledgling lesbian rights group in London. And they shared materials. They all, of course, subscribed to the latter. They went a slightly different direction, the MRG did, in terms of organizing an actual sort of club where people could gather and dance and drink and get together, which lasted for about 5 years or 10. I'm not exactly positive how long it sort of went through different permutations. Sometimes it was open, sometimes it wasn't. But they also wrote about MRG in the latter, and they helped the organizers in London. Esme Langley was the name of the most well-known organizer of MRG in London. And in Australia, the very first gay group was a DOB chapter. And I believe it was organized in Melbourne. I'm not positive beyond that information. I'm not positive who made it happen, but that was the reach. And then, of course, somehow Ger Van Brom found a copy at her sister's home in Indonesia. So the reach, it'd be a fascinating project, actually, to try to figure out just how far, especially the magazine's reach was. I'm sure it was beyond those 3 examples. So if anybody wants a really cool research project, that'd be one.
That would be. So someone says here, I believe someone said the Boston chapter had a location into the 2000s. Yeah, that was Marcy.
Yes.
Do we know why that lasted so long compared to others?
The 2 women who, and I'm blanking on their names, forgive me, who started and maintained the Boston chapter, kept it going. And when I interviewed them toward the end of the project, they were still hosting Thanksgiving dinners every year. It was sort of, things had dwindled because there were so many other opportunities, but they continued to host Thanksgiving dinners because they recognized that some people could not go home. And so provided a space in Boston for lesbians who wanted to be together to do that on that holiday. Boston was remarkable, having started sort of late, but continuing on to the early 2000s. Sherry and Lois, I believe, were the names of the women, but I'm blanking on their last names. But they were really dedicated and kept things going.
Yeah, that was really interesting to learn that a group had lasted into the 2000s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the idea, as you pointed out, I think, of providing a space for people, especially around family-oriented holidays like Thanksgiving, became, I think, one of the reasons they kept the space going, was so that they could have a place for people to gather on times when they couldn't go home.
Yeah, that is nice. That it kind of relates to this next question. Someone asked, what was the most interesting fact or story you learned in your research? And I guess that's for any of us.
Shayne, you want to start with that while I think about it?
Oh, are you unable to unmute?
There we go.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just say, we talked about this, Marcia, Amanda, and I talked about this in our prep call a week ago. I think one of the things that struck me as interesting that I didn't really know until I started digging in more for this talk is that there was more crossover between the DOB and the Mattachine Society than I understood. I knew that they shared an office and they maybe shared a phone and a mimeograph machine, but they were really doing a lot more than that. They were attending social groups together or social events together and these panels. And then there was a lot of crossover in terms of their early national conventions as well. yeah, I always thought of them as two very, very separate movements, but Marcia, you probably can speak to that more than I.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right. And that was certainly true in LA. The LA chapter was very connected to One Inc. As well as Mattachine. And kind of, in fact, one of the lead organizers had been, she's on the cover of One magazine, Stella Rush, who went by Sten Russell. So they, yeah. So, but it's interesting to note that as sort of women's liberation, feminist activisms really heated up in the 70s, Del Martin penned this sort of famous scathing goodbye to all that, where she took on the sexism of many of the male homophile and gay rights activists. And she and Phyllis really took a turn, I think, and started to put much more energy into NOW and into other feminist organizations, including going to the International Women's Year conferences. So there was a split around that. And so I think that depending on who you talk to when, in terms of the partnering with gay men, it came out differently, because by the time I rolled around, they were all about the girls. They wanted to. They were really somewhat discounting of their involvement with the gay men in San Francisco. But that was certainly not true for Barbara and Kay, and it wasn't true for the women in LA either. So.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that always stuck with me in the researching this period is when I think it was Barbara who said at their meetings in the early days, 1958, 59, 60, early 60s, they would invite psychiatrists who were homophobic and told them that they were degenerates, they had a mental disease. But she said it was just the fact that this person was acknowledging our existence. They were just that. And so to have someone talking to us about us, even if it wasn't positive, really kind of, I think, speaks to the oppression, complete and utter oppression of that era, and the importance of visibility and representation, and being able to see yourself in media and all forms of fields that they were all working to fight for, so so that you don't have to rely on just hearing from a homophobic person simply because they're acknowledging your existence. That's always just stuck with me.
Yeah. One of the interesting things for me as a former ACLU staff person is that one of their first meetings, they invited the head of the San Francisco ACLU, Ernie Bessig, to come and tell them, okay, so exactly what kinds of rights do we have? And I think the answer was not many. But they made that link, they made that connection in terms of, and of course, we know they reached out to medical people, they reached out to psychiatrists, psychologists, they reached out to police officers. That was another big dust up in the 70s and 80s with Del and Phyllis in San Francisco, wanting the women's building in San Francisco to welcome female police officers, and other folks who were making the women's building into a safe space for everyone, including undocumented women, said, we can't do that. So again, depending on when, depending on how things were falling politically, they made different decisions.
Right. So we have a question here that I would love to bring more attention to. We had talked about this before the program. So this is such a bomb for me as a queer preservationist in a red state. Shayne, I believe you mentioned that the Lyon Martin House was under threat of demolition by neglect. Can you talk more about that and how it got into that state?
Sure. So as was mentioned earlier, Del Martin passed away in 2008, and Phyllis Lyon continued to live in the house at 651 Duncan through, I believe, April 2020 when she died. And the house went on the market that later that fall. And once we organized as Friends of Lion Martin House, we understood that the house was proposed for demolition because the Lion Martin House is on 2 legal lots, 649 and 651 Duncan. And so it was a very attractive place for a buyer to potentially, demolish everything and build a brand new. What's proposed for this site is a 4-story house over a garage and a basement. So the issue now is that the house has been basically vacant and deteriorating, and it hasn't had any sort of mothballing in terms of, protecting it. The roof is failing. When I was in there in October 2021, there was water infiltration in the kitchen. There were vines growing through the kitchen window. There were rodent holes. There was an insect infestation in the living room. So the house is just in bad shape. And long story short, the property owner just won't budge in terms of letting us access the property to protect the house. She is open to selling the property, but the price is as of a year ago was $1.25 million. So Friends of Lion Martin House has worked very hard to come up with a future new use for this property, to return it to community use. Our idea is an activist in residence or an archivist in residence who could work closely with the Lion Martin papers at the LGBT Historical Society. But all of this is going to take a lot of fundraising and time. But meanwhile, the house is just sitting there, and it wasn't in good shape 4 years ago, and I can't imagine it's in better shape now. So we're worried that what happens sometimes in these situations is the property owner will just let it deteriorate to the point where it's red tagged and then would be approved for demolition. So that's the unfortunate truth about the situation now. But if anyone wants to get involved with Friends of Lion Martin House, reach out to me. We're about to start activating again, and maybe potentially a capital campaign to purchase the house and get it back into community use.
Mhm.
That would be really great. So can you say a little more about the multiracial, multi-ethnic nature of the group at a time when social segregation was still the norm?
Well, I'll sort of revise and reframe what I was told, which was I don't believe that Del and Phyllis set out to create a interracial, multiracial organization. When I would ask about, Pat or Cleo or other folks who were African-American or Latino or Filipina, they would say, we would take anybody who wanted to get involved. Later, I think that their consciousness was raised through their activism with DOB and these women, but also through their alliances with Cecil Williams. I think he was a vital component of their sort of not only doing the work with religious leaders, but also doing the work in the Tenderloin with the people that would come in to get help from GLIDE, which was all kinds of people. So I think that they had they were liberals. They were good liberals. They were ACLU members. They supported the civil rights movement. But I think that I'm not sure that they went out and sought to diversify who came to the parties. I think it was, in some ways it was luck. In some ways it was, what else are you going to do? We don't want to get arrested. And then, as you pointed out, Shayne, in terms of your work on Rose and Rosemary, they were coming together as a couple, looking for a place where they could be accepted. So, later, I think that there was much more attention paid, especially that 5-hour interview that I mentioned of Barbara and Kay with Ernestine Eppinger, which is phenomenal, where she's really schooling them. And you can imagine her schooling the New York chapter about racism and about the need to fight it, along with sexism and homophobia.
I have a question also about talking about the relationship between DOB and now, and the person asking the question was, my understanding was that it wasn't very good.
Shayne, did you want to weigh in on that, or
Yeah.
no? It all again, it depended where you were, and I think where your orientation was. In San Francisco, Del and Phyllis became very good friends with a woman who was the second national president of the National Organization of Women, which is Eileen Hernandez, who deserves a documentary of her own. She was phenomenal. African-American woman who led many organizations in the city. And they became fast friends and worked with her in NOW locally. In terms of the larger NOW organization, I mean, we all know about the lesbian menace sort of action and all the work that had to be done against Betty Friedan. But I think when Eileen took over as the national president, things started to shift, and there was definitely more collegiality between DOB and NOW in those years.
We have a question. Since women's and lesbian rights are under renewed attacks, have any women attempted to restart DOB?
I saw that. I haven't heard about it, but
Yeah.
I would join.
The Boston one.
Yeah.
Could any of us talk about a bit about documenting these kinds of lesbian spaces in less urban communities? Did they exist? And is that something folks are also working on? Actually, Ken is and Shayne are working on this this LGBTQ nationwide network, heritage preservation of LGBTQ spaces. And I think we're in the works and putting together a website. Ken may be able to, if you want to chime in or not. I don't want to put you
Sure,
on the spot.
no. It's important, especially in today's climate, for people to know. With Mellon funding a few years ago, we identified a need that there are people across the country doing this work, such as what we're doing in New York. We knew about Shayne, but there felt like a need to connect people with an informal network of communication. So we did a survey that identified many, many individuals in projects throughout the country, basically taking an inventory, not of specific sites, but of projects that are looking at that, whether they're preservation-based, whether they're collections at museums, people reinterpreting house museums for LGBTQ history, oral histories that have some connection and information that would be used for site-based preservation LGBT history. So that said, we're creating a sort of a landing page website. It's going to have a page of resources that are now being taken down by many other federal sites, but it will include all the examples that Amanda talked about earlier: National Register nominations, historic context statements. The theme study that's now on Out History will replicate it there. And also we'll have a forum page, which is basically will be a less sort of a listserv of sorts for people to pose questions that will be moderated. So that's a national effort, but specifically there are groups that are looking at women's music venues that took place in the 1970s. There are oral history projects, old lesbian history oral project. I just communicated with a woman who did a bunch of interviews for that. So there are groups around the country doing this type of work in less urban communities. Obviously, the urban existence, because of the density, is valuable and much more sort of legible on the landscape. But for example, in New York State, a commune, an LGBTQ commune, was just listed on the National Register for Historic Places in Ithaca. So that included women and men communing together. There was a site in Staten Island, but that's been demolished. But those type of things we're really looking at to expand people's understanding that this history is everywhere. And I want to thank Mark Stein, who I think may still be on here, who is a professor of this history, but also overseeing Out History's website now, and took the reins of getting that information and the Pride Guide that was removed from the National Park website. I'm going to start crying. I just find it really compelling and important that all you people showed up today, and that it's a call to action to be vigilant and not let Roy Cohn propaganda and way he behaved, let that happen again. It's too important 70 years later to sort of look at this in the abyss and not know that we have our own playbook and we can't go back. So I'm just leaving that as a call for action for everybody.
Yes,
And everybody's little bit helps. Everybody is, attendance here sends a message. So thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you.
I wanted to also get this question in. You mentioned NOW and DOB key members allying themselves with the broader women's movement after breaking with Mattachine. How would you orient the DOB at a time when working class dyke cultures, especially butch high femme, were receding as lesbian culture became more college educated and middle classified?
It's interesting. I think that, and again, I'm channeling Del and Phil, and Barbara and Kay too, to some degree, which is that their focus was on a big tent. And I think that they tried to incorporate, and as you were describing the events that were held in New York, for example, I was thinking about the fact that I'm sure people were bumping up against each other who had very different styles of presentation, very different sexual and gender identities. And so I think that they evolved to understand that, it's a big tent, and that everybody was needed to be a part of the move toward liberation and freedom. That's the best way to put it. I'm sure that I know in the early days, they really discouraged butch women from coming to DOB meetings in, wearing men's clothing, because they were afraid of them getting in trouble either on their way to the meeting, on their way home from the meeting, or causing people to be too afraid to come back if they thought that they might be typed in a way that put them in danger. So there was, again, an evolution, I think, as time went on, from the early days when there was a more shall we say, middle class approach to how to present oneself. That became, as the decades went on, I think that they started to understand, again, we need everybody, and so we're going to manage our prejudices and try to overcome them. I think that's the best take on it that I could give. I do know that there were women who did not return after the first couple of meetings because they felt like, as working class butch femme couples, they weren't welcome. And did you want to add anything, either of you?
Amanda, I think maybe one final question before we wrap.
Yeah, I think there was, someone just pointed out that there's a lesbian queer oral history project working on a website for historic places in Northwest Arkansas. So that'll be hopefully completed later this year. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that one. And I think there was one question, I think further back, it was a little pop culture question. Grey's Anatomy, the character of Meredith Grey. Wonder if any connection to Marion Glass's pseudonym, which that would be something.
That would be something.
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know how they figured out their pseudonyms, actually.
Yeah. Actually, Marion's apartment in Woodside, the building still stands, and that's something that I want to map, because we're always looking to add more sites in the boroughs outside Manhattan. So, yeah.
You've done an amazing job. You really have.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Marcia and Shayne, for joining me tonight, and for everyone who joined us for this chat. If you came in late or would like to see this again, or have friends who would have liked to have attended, this will be up on our YouTube channel, and we'll be sending out an email about that when it's up, or you can always subscribe to our channel and find other programs from the past there. And so thank you again, everyone. This was really great. The chat was taking off, which is great. I'm seeing a lot of this after the fact. So hope you all have a great rest of your week, and thank you for your support.
And remember Kay's words, do something.
Yes, the wise Kayla Husen.
Thank you.
Wow, the Netherlands. That's great.
Oh, that is great.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. Much
Oh,
appreciated.
wow. Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Cheers from Mexico, Netherlands. Yay.
Thank you, Shayne. Thank you,
Amanda, this was awesome.
Marcia.
Thank you for organizing.
Yes.
Hey, Deb,
Thank you,
how you doing?
And who's it? Think of Bev Hickok, by the way, Marcia, while we're
Yeah.
tuning down. I was in Northern California last week, and I got to see Shayne in person, which is really great. And I saw my friend Stephanie left a really sweet comment in the chat. But I went to the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National
Ooh.
Historic Park.
Ooh.
And as of last week, the LGBTQ history interpretation was still there in the museum. And I was reading, I was looking at a name, said Bev Hickok. Why does that sound familiar? Because I'm not as familiar with San Francisco's history. That's the image that we used, the Daughters of Bilitis San Francisco breakfast, the image that we've used to help promote this program. She's second from right next to Phyllis Lyon. So she was a World War II veteran. So, on the 80th anniversary of World War II, she was in Waves in LA. And she's a quote there talking about, that another watershed moment, obviously World War II, and bringing a lot of LGBTQ people to urban centers where they met each other for the first time. So that, So anyway, that was just a fun, I texted Shayne, I said, look at this, Bev
What a
Hickok.
catch, really.
Very cool.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I just want to, if they're still here, thanks from Scotland. Thanks
Scotland
from
and Albania.
Great.
Gosh.
Thank you, Jeff. for
Wonderful.
coming.
Yes,
Again.
Jeff Ivanone, thank you so much. He wrote the Lavender Hill Commune National Register nomination that Ken mentioned in Central New York, and has also written some entries for our website. So thank you, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
And I see Theodora Minucci over there. She's still
From the days of the Bagatelle. We have the Bagatelle on our website.
Okay. Hi. Yeah.
I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
And thank you.